I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, Naturopathic Doctor. Okay, welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. Today we're talking all things thyroid, and I am joined by my good friend, Dr. Sarah Vadeboncoeur, who practices in Ottawa. Sarah, your practice has shifted to be almost exclusively helping women who suffer from thyroid imbalance. And I'm so grateful that we're going to spend the time together today because this is something that I think we see as women see a ton of online. Women are really confused as to what role their thyroid plays in their health even. Often blame the thyroid for everything that's going on in their health. But then when they do get diagnosed with thyroid imbalance, I think are really the information women are getting is a bit misguided as to how they need to shift and evolve, especially their nutrition, which is where I want you and I to spend some time focusing today. First of all, I want to thank you for being on the show with me.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
So can you, how did you come to choose thyroid as being the thing you focus on? Or did thyroid choose you? Help us understand your evolution of your practice and where you got to this place where you support women.
Yeah, thyroid chose me. So I'm very happy that it chose me because I love helping women with thyroid. But kind of how I came to this place in my career and how I approach thyroid really started with my own kind of experiences with my health. And I've always been a very healthy person, but I always lived in a slightly larger body. And the first time I remember being made aware of my weight was in grade 5. For some reason, they decided to weigh and measure all of us. And my weight was very close to being 100 pounds. And I remember feeling so ashamed and embarrassed by that number. And, weight was something a lot of us women through our, teens and 20s and 30s, something that I kind of fought against and tried to change through dieting, through nutrition, through exercise. And when I entered my practice 10 years ago and I was working mostly with women, I saw that weight was, a concern that so many women were worried about. It was always one of the main things that they wanted to change or improve. And now that my practice has focused more specifically on thyroid, I'm continuing obviously to see a lot of, weight concerns. And what has kind of driven me in the last couple of years is to, number one, to help women understand how their thyroid works, is to help them kind of access the right type of testing so that they can be diagnosed properly, and then to help them understand how they can properly care for their thyroid and how they can hopefully land at a weight that feels happy and comfortable, but that doesn't involve dieting. And that's a big part of what drives me, especially just in the last year, is to really offer an alternate narrative or a different message to women with thyroid conditions. And especially when weight is a concern, that dieting is not the answer. If anything, dieting may be part of what's causing some of the weight issues and might actually be causing more harm to the thyroid. So that's really where I've kind of landed in terms of my practice.
So maybe you can walk us through, because I'm sure you have a great sort of analogies and ways of describing how the thyroid actually works. Can you just walk us through how you explain that to your patients when they come in and they say, I think that my thyroid is an issue? What do they need to be looking for in their own health as far as symptoms? But what does the thyroid actually do? Let's even just start there.
Yeah. The thyroid essentially controls the rate at which everything happens in your body, which the easiest word to describe that is metabolism, right? But when we think about metabolism, we always think about our weight. We think about how many calories we're burning. But metabolism is essentially how quickly or slowly all the different things are happening in the body. So a big part of what thyroid does is it impacts that. And it also has a huge impact in terms of growth and development in the body. So we have thyroid receptors essentially everywhere in our system. And so our thyroid impacts everything from our weight to how much hair we have on our head, to our mood, to how quickly or slowly our digestion works. It impacts all of these things. And the best kind of analogy or way that I've found to describe, what it feels like or what happens if your thyroid is not working well, which is that you feel like you're living life in slow motion. Everything just feels more difficult when your thyroid is not working properly. You're going to feel exhausted. You'll find that your brain doesn't, work as quickly as you want it to. You're probably feeling cold. You might be putting on weight. You might be constipated. But it literally changes, again, the rate or the speed at which everything is happening in your body. So it really impacts everything from head to toe.
And I think that speaks to why it can be so difficult for us to flag patients as having low thyroid, because that sounds like a lot of things.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And even I think that we've normalized some of those symptoms in women as being part of our busy North American, of course, you've got 3 kids kind of way that we imagine women's health, that I think that leads women to being relatively under-assessed, right? Because we've normalized weight gain and fatigue and brain fog. And of course, right, of course you feel that way, right? Like, and cite all of the reasons in her life that may be making her have those symptoms. And I think that probably speaks to like the general under-assessment of women for low thyroid.
Yeah. And what we know is that it's estimated that 50 to 60% of women with a thyroid condition do not yet have a diagnosis, meaning they have a thyroid condition. The most common thyroid condition is hypothyroidism, and that is where the thyroid is slow or sluggish and doesn't produce enough hormone. And that affects about 1 in 8 women. And half of those don't have a diagnosis, which means they're having symptoms, they're having weight gain and fatigue and all the things we just talked about due to their thyroid, but no one has tested them or no one has appropriately assessed them to provide that diagnosis.
And there is a difference between, the sort of very surface kind of tip of the iceberg testing for a thyroid versus having a complete thyroid panel run, right? And I think that can probably make that differentiation between, frank hypothyroidism, meaning like you have full-blown hypothyroidism. Even if we run one test, we're going to find
Let's
it.
see it. Yeah.
Versus subclinical hypothyroidism, we call it, where it's, some of your numbers are maybe abnormal. Can you just walk us through like what women kind of get out of their conventional healthcare experience and why that may lead to us not being that well assessed?
Yeah, absolutely. So the test that most people have maybe heard of when we're looking at thyroid is a TSH test. And TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. And this is a hormone that's made in your pituitary gland, which sits in your brain. So the first thing I like to teach women is that the test that we are using for diagnosis is not actually made by your thyroid, it's made by the brain. So we're using an indirect test to see what your thyroid is doing. The analogy I've been using is that if you were wondering how one of your friends was doing, would you go and knock on her door and ask how she's doing? Or would you go knock at her neighbor's 3 doors down and ask? You'd probably just go directly to your friend. You're going to get a more accurate answer. But when we're looking at TSH, we're asking, the brain, how is the thyroid doing? And sometimes the brain gives us the right answer. A lot of times it doesn't give a complete or a correct answer. So TSH is basically just telling you, is the brain sending the right signal to the thyroid? That's what TSH tells us. And when, like you said, when there's overt hypothyroidism or thyroid disorder, that number will be off. The next thing that we look at is T4. So T4 is the hormone that's made by your thyroid. So if you want to know how your actual thyroid is doing, this is the one that's most accurate because it's the one that's actually made by your thyroid. And then the other one that's really important is the hormone called T3. And T3, I would say, is my favorite hormone because it's the one that makes us feel good, right? It's the one that gives us energy. It's the one that helps us make serotonin, which obviously has a huge impact on our mood. It helps to rev up our metabolism. It helps us to break down cholesterol. So that's the actual active thyroid hormone. When we think about all the benefits that we associate with our thyroid, most of those are coming from a little bit from T4, but mostly from T3. And those are tests that are rarely being tested in the conventional system. So it's very common, and I see this all the time, where TSH, again, made in the brain, is normal. But when we look further downstream at T4 and T3, we find problems. And so that's why so many women are not being diagnosed, because we're only looking at that very top piece of the puzzle. The other thing I'll add is that the number one cause of hypothyroidism is a condition called Hashimoto's. And Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition. And in order to know whether or not you have that, you want to be testing your thyroid antibodies. So there's two that we look at. And again, if you don't look at that, you may not understand what's causing the thyroid problem. And what we know is that Hashimoto's will typically develop often 5 to 10 years before the hypothyroidism. So what that means is that your TSH and your other thyroid tests may look perfectly normal, but your thyroid antibodies are high. And I've had several cases where I've been able to find the Hashimoto's before they became hypothyroid. And this is preventative medicine at its best, right? We're able to find the problem before it destroys the thyroid. And so that's really what I do in my practice when I'm working with women, is I'm looking at all of the pieces of the puzzle. And that way, if there's anything going wrong at any of the different levels we talked about, we're able to find it, and we're able to talk about what the appropriate treatments are.
Yeah, and that's so much more thorough. And I think women can feel super frustrated when they feel like they have a thyroid issue, they've read about thyroid issues, and then they either get told that their lab work is fine when they kind of, say, know deep in their soul that something is not fine, or they try and advocate for themselves to have more testing done, and they're told that it's not important and not necessary.
Yeah. And that is something I see in my office all the time. And I think that's a reflection of our current medical system, that, we're waiting for things to be a full-blown disease before we treat. Right. So I think what we offer as naturopathic doctors is we're trying to catch things, ideally before they become a full-blown disease. And we're trying to just be more comprehensive, potentially just looking at all the different pieces of the puzzle, because there's so much that we can do as naturopathic doctors to help with thyroid, versus the conventional approach is you take your medication, you're going to be on it for the rest of your life, come back to get your levels checked once a year, and see you later.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly taking medication can be a very important part of your thyroid treatment plan, but it's a very small part of it. If that's all you're doing, you're probably missing a lot of opportunity to improve your thyroid health. So I think that's where I really step in, is I'm like, great, you're on your medication. Let's make sure it's the right dose. Let's make sure you're using it properly. And maybe we can talk a bit more about that. And then let's look at all the other factors that are in your control, how much water you're drinking, the type of food that you're eating, how much movement you're doing, your stress and your sleep. How can we create lifestyle and nutrition patterns that support your thyroid to work as well as it can?
I love that. And it's, and I think when we look at that sort of one test, one solution, or they look at the one test, and it doesn't matter conventionally if we're talking about the autoimmune version of hypothyroidism. I mean,
Right.
It's kind of, I like that phrase, and it doesn't totally fit, but that phrase where it's like, when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. It's that kind of idea. Like, we're not shifting the treatment for hypothyroidism significantly within conventional care, right? We're not having those wider, deeper conversations about, does your exercise or fasting or ketogenic diet or all the things that you're doing, do those things have a positive or negative impact on your thyroid, which we know that they do. Instead, we're treating numbers. We're not treating to symptoms. And that's why that's the kind of experience that you get when you're not working with someone that's looking at that more sort of like, I hate the word holistic, but that more holistic version of healthcare. And that's why that level of testing is being done, because they're not using that information for anything. So to their credit, that's why they don't do additional tests, because it's not like they're going to read them and evolve your plan to be something more exciting or special. They truly are being guided by that one number. It's if you're not well after that one number is being treated, right? Which we see a ton, that women
all the time
have symptoms, even though on paper they should be fine, right? I can't think of anything more frustrating for women than that.
Right. And I'd love to kind of elaborate on that. And again, when we're just looking at TSH to say you're fine, we don't actually know anything about how your thyroid is doing because TSH is not made in your thyroid. So, specifically for people who are on medication, T4 is actually the best gauge of your dosing to see if you're taking the right amount, because the most common thyroid medicines that we see, things like Synthroid and levothyroxine and Altroxin, these are all medications that replace T4. So if you want to get a good sense of your dosing, you want to look at T4 because that's what you're taking. The next thing you want to look at is how is your body actually taking that medication and using it. And that's where T3 becomes really important, right? Because T4 is called a prohormone, and that's because it's mostly inactive. T4's main job in life is to get converted into T3. And so when you're taking a medicine that's T4 like Synthroid, your body has to take that and it has to convert it into T3 for you to have the benefits. If no one is testing your T4 or your T3, you have no idea if you're actually using your medication properly and if you're getting the full benefit of that. One of the things that we know you need in order to properly convert your medicine into T3 is iron. What is the number one nutrient deficiency we see in our office every single day in women? Iron deficiency. So right off the bat, most women are at a deficit in terms of their ability to properly use a medication like that. And again, if you're not looking at the full picture, you don't have any of that context or information. That can be so useful, especially when women are, again, they're, properly medicated according to their levels. They're told everything is normal, and yet they continue to have symptoms. Well, when I dig a bit deeper, I often understand why, because some of these other numbers are not optimal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about some of those lifestyle things that impact thyroid, because I think because we sort of have that bullet solution for those numbers, right? And conventionally, that's how thyroid is often supported. I like what you said there, that it's like, take this every day, I'll see you next year, right? Like, and that's,
And that's the conversation
it is.
for
And
some
it's,
patients.
and
Yeah.
often I ask people, like, has your dose changed in the last 10
Yeah.
years? They're like, no,
No.
it's always the same. So I'm like, so whether you were pregnant or 15 pounds lighter or more active or working night shift, or like, none of these things influenced what we thought you might need as far as support. And so we're missing like a huge amount of that conversation. And I think part of the reason I wanted us to have this conversation, I know you're passionate about this too, is that some of the like frank marketing to women around their health and diet and all of that is very anti-thyroid. And I don't know if women always know that or are always mindful of the impact that their lifestyle choices and the extreme lifestyle choices that they make influence their thyroid health. So can you walk us through, like, when you're starting to try and nail down what and I'm going to say cause, but like loosely in air quotes, the cause of some of those thyroid imbalances are having, what are you looking for? Like, what are you screening for in those women? You mentioned hydration and
Yeah.
diet and all of that.
So there's two that we can't change, which are being a woman, which more than doubles our risk. So sorry, ladies, that's part of what we get. And the other piece is a family history. So those are both things that tend to increase your odds of getting a thyroid disease by more than double. What I learned recently, very recently, and I found shocking, is that there are two other factors which are actually increasing your risk far more than being a woman and having a family history. Those are drinking fluoridated tap water and physical inactivity. When we look at the risk of drinking fluoridated water and when we look at physical inactivity, those tend to increase your risk more than your family history and of being a woman. So one of the things we talk about is just looking at hydration. Number one, looking at what you're drinking and how much, but something as simple as getting a good water filter that can remove some of the chlorine and fluoride from your water could potentially make a significant difference, especially if you're consuming what everyone tells you to do, which is to drink 2+ liters a day of water. And one of the things that I learned in this research is that our treatment for hyperthyroidism before we had kind of pharmaceuticals was fluoride. that is what we used to give people to slow down their thyroid. And now, for a variety of reasons that we won't get into, we've added fluoride to our water. And certainly there are benefits to that for dental health. But one of the pitfalls, especially for women with thyroid conditions, is that fluoride can really be harmful, especially in higher quantities for thyroid. So that's one of the first things we do, is let's look at the type of water you're drinking and try to get some filtered water. The biggest risk factor is physical inactivity. So if we are not moving enough, and this doesn't mean that we need to do extreme forms of exercise, it means we need to not sit on our bums all day long. We need to be walking, we need to be moving. That alone can make a significant difference. So those are two things that are relatively easy, relatively inexpensive things from a lifestyle perspective that you could look at. The nutrition piece is the part that I love. And part of that is that, like you said, when you look at what is being suggested and recommended to women in the online space, and even by many practitioners, is very restrictive. It's diet oriented. It's calorie restriction. It's cutting out entire food groups. And what most women don't realize is that can have a really negative impact on your thyroid. And the reason is that, again, your thyroid is very sensitive to stress. So when your body feels under stress, whether it's from a pandemic or, a marital relationship, or from under eating, when your brain perceives stress, it does a whole bunch of things. But one of the things that happens is it actually slows down your thyroid function because it's trying to help you survive. Your brain ultimate goal is survival. And so anytime it perceives a threat, it will trigger this kind of fight or flight survival mode. And part of that mode is a slowing down of the thyroid so that you don't burn as many calories, so that you conserve energy, so that you can literally live longer. So part of what I see in the online space is that so many of the diets that are being recommended specifically for thyroid are very restrictive, which ends up for most women causing immense psychological stress, social stress, because they can't eat what their kids are eating or what their friends are eating. And that ends up having a negative impact on thyroid. So a big part of what I'm happy to chat about is how we can look at a different way to approach thyroid, because I think the common way that we look at it, and if you Google, thyroid diet, what you're going to see are lists of all the foods you cannot eat, right? Mm-hmm. It's gluten-free, it's grain-free, it's paleo, it's AIP, which is autoimmune protocol. I was just talking about this with my thyroid group earlier today. AIP is grain-free, dairy-free, soy-free, corn-free, egg-free, nut-free, soy-free, and seed-free. What's left? Fruits, vegetables, meat, seafood, and fat, which for some women might seem okay, but in the long run, that diet has a lot of restrictions, which again, for most women, the harm is going to be much greater than any possible benefit.
It's interesting. I was just talking with our women's health group. We talked about blood sugar regulation and diet this past month. And when I was asking them, I'm like, well, how would you describe your diet, right? Like, what are the words that come to mind when you describe your diet? And I see this with patients too, is that the way that women describe their diet is by describing all the foods they don't eat, right? It was like, well, what's your diet? Oh, I eat vegan, right? Which is really just another way of saying that they don't eat animal protein or animal products. Yeah. What's your diet like? I don't eat fish, right? I don't eat nuts. I don't eat dairy. I don't eat legumes. I don't eat soy. I don't eat gluten, right? Mm-hmm. That no one is saying, I eat an abundance of fruits and vegetables, right? Or I primarily choose lean meat options, that are local and whatever, right? Like, that's not really how people or women describe their diet. They talk about the restriction, because the restriction is what in general we're giving gold stars for, right? That's how women feel successful in their food journey, is by how much restriction they have. And that's what their identity around their nutrition is, about the foods that they've said no to, not about the foods that they've said yes to.
Yeah. There's a quote by Michael Pollan that I absolutely love that kind of explains this so beautifully, which is when he shared the word chocolate cake to a group of North Americans, their association with chocolate cake was guilt. when he shared the word chocolate cake with a group of people from France, their association was celebration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like is such like a sad but poignant way to look at how we have developed in terms of our relationship with food, and how we're so hyper focused on every single food that crosses our lips, right? How much fat is in here? How many carbs am I eating? How much protein is in here? How much vitamin C is in here? And part of what I'm kind of teaching the women that I work with, let's take a step back and let's look at the big picture. There is no one food that's going to make or break your health. You need to look at what does a whole day look like? What does a week or a month look like? And is that ensemble of food bringing you towards where you want to be in your health, or is it moving you away from it? But I think we've become so hyper focused on all the details that we've lost sight of the big picture. And now we actually spend way too much time and energy focused on food at the expense of some of these other factors that are just as important, if not more. Things like our physical movement, things like our ability to manage stress, things like how much sleep we're getting, our social connections. All of those things are important, but they're hard to focus on when you're spending your entire day counting and planning and thinking about food.
Yes. That's so important. It's interesting. Back in the day when we were and when I was in naturopathic college, I worked at the Big Carrot, the health food store in
Mm-hmm.
Toronto, and I like distinctly remember the week that goji berries became a thing. I just think, which I don't know why I'm telling this sort of like sidebar story, but I think it's because what it showed me, and I was a student, right? And I all of a sudden there's like shelves were bare, and not only that, we had 4 or 5 companies that all of a sudden overnight were mass producers of goji juice. And so we had an entire part of the store dedicated to this special juice made from this special berry from a special part of the rainforest. And like we couldn't keep it on the shelf, right? It was like flying off the shelves. People wanted rain checks for the price of the goji berry juice. And like it was just like, and I remember sitting there going, like, what is happening? Like, do they know the blueberries are probably okay too, right?
Yeah.
But they got hyper focused on this idea that there was going to be this one food that cured them. And I think the way that industry really works really thrives on our, well, we kind of want to take a pill for something sort of
Yeah.
mindset, right? Like it's funny because on the one hand we can say it's ridiculous they'll only test our TSH and that they only give us one pill to solve this problem, but then on the other end we like really kind of wish there was this one food that magically cured our diet, right?
We do. And like we were talking about this before we came on, but like the celery juice craze was another more recent example where like, I don't know if you noticed, like a year or two ago, the price of celery was insane because everyone was juicing celery because the medical medium said that celery juice will heal all of the ailments you've ever had. And people went bananas and they started drinking celery juice. And there's nothing special about celery juice. The benefit you're getting, and I know you talk a lot about this, is probably just because you're eating more vegetables. You're getting extra doses of vegetables, but there's no additional benefit from just eating celery or any other fruit or vegetable. They're all good. But yeah, we want this magic answer that's going to fix everything, because I think the message that you and I try to share is it's a very balanced, moderate approach, but it's not sexy. Like,
No.
we don't have anything to sell. We don't have like sexy headlines because we're just teaching like common sense, whole
Yep.
food nutrition.
Eat moderately well most of the time.
Exactly. But that doesn't like stand out next to the goji berries and the celery juice because it's not as sexy, right?
Mm-hmm. But I understand why women are seeking those kinds of special solutions because they feel unheard, right? And so it feels like they need to be this detective and advocate for themselves and find this latest and greatest cure because no one's really heard their story. No one's really come to deeply understand or be curious or about their healthcare, right? So it leaves them to try and be the expert of their own situation. And of course, it can feel really hopeful when they see a website that claims if they all they have to do is cut out this one big food group and they would be magically cured. Like it's of course, right? They feel vulnerable. But I think what our goals are is to try and teach women about their nutrition so that they feel like they can just rely on their own intuition to make those decisions. And because I feel like having good nutritional knowledge should be a basic human right?
Mhm.
Like having a 42-year-old woman sit across the table from me and not know how much protein she needs to survive and thrive, I feel like is a complete failure of our education system that we have not taught human beings how to feed themselves. Um, and so, of course, she's attracted to these special diets, and she's a perfect target for marketing because she's confused and vulnerable and feels frustrated, and they offer hope and a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like a part of what I'm also so passionate about is that we have totally delegated nutrition, right? We look outside of ourselves, we look to experts, we look to nutritionists and doctors, and we look to Dr. Google to tell us what to eat. Those doctors and nutritionists don't know anything about you, but yet we think that they know better because of whatever degree or experience they have. We think that they know what we need to eat more than we know ourselves. So part of what I agree with is that when you don't understand how your own body works and you don't understand the basic principles of nourishing yourself, of course you're going to look to the outside to have someone tell you what to do. And part of what the work that I'm doing, both with myself and with my patients, is teaching women to start tuning in and to actually start to look inside yourself and to start to see what your own body wants and needs in terms of nutrition. Because I can guarantee that your body is a better gauge or a better way to determine what you need than any book. And I include myself in this. Like, I'm here to give suggestions, but more and more I'm trying to not be prescriptive with my recommendations, because I want women to actually learn how to figure it out for themselves. Because we've totally lost that, right? And especially like you said, when you don't feel good, maybe your doctor hasn't been helpful in the way that you wanted. You're looking for answers, and obviously the web is a place where you can get all kinds of answers, but doesn't mean that they're right for you.
So can you maybe go through that and describe a little bit because about that sort of concept of intuitive eating and being a
Yeah.
little bit more connected with eating choice? Because it's funny when that phrase came out, intuitive eating, I admit like my first thought was like, no, I would intuitively eat all the things, right? I would
Yes.
intuitively eat until I was sick
Yeah.
because, right?
Yeah.
Which probably speaks more to like the fact that my nutrition has been raised on that whole concept of restriction and calorie tracking and macronutrient management
Mm-hmm.
and all of that, which I'm
Yep.
fully willing to admit that that's my bias. But when I first saw that concept of intuitive, I'm like, I'm not capable of that actually. And I don't think
Yeah.
anyone is. Now, certainly
Yeah.
I've come to understand that what that phrase means better, but I will still have women say like, well, I would intuitively eat the whole cake.
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to listen to yourself about nutrition, especially when women don't know what to eat, right? I feel like that would be a scary step to take.
Yeah, it is a scary step to take. And it is scary because of what we just talked about, that women don't trust themselves. They don't trust that their own body is capable of making the right decisions, and they don't trust that they will make the right decisions based on what their body's telling them. So, this idea that intuitive eating means that you can eat whatever you want whenever you want is incorrect. Intuitive eating is the idea that you are eating mindfully and consciously. A simple example or simple thing to start to look at is, when are you actually hungry? Do you eat breakfast because it's 7 a.m. on the clock, or do you eat breakfast because you are physically hungry? That would be one of the kind of starter ways to actually just start to listen to your own signals. Most of us don't even know when we're hungry or full, because that's not what guides our eating anymore. We eat at set times because that's what makes sense for the busy and crazy world we live in. In terms of the eating the chocolate cake, that can happen in the beginning, because what is happening is you are finally releasing restriction. And typically, binging is the result of restriction. So when women think they're going to eat all the chocolate cake, they may overeat and they may not pick, quote unquote, healthy foods in the beginning, because they're moving from one extreme, which was restriction, where they had lots of rules and maybe they were restricting what they eat or how much they eat. And when you let that go, it's kind of like a slingshot. You're going to land temporarily a bit further out, which might involve some binging and eating chips and cakes and whatever else is your thing. But once you kind of come out of those extremes and you land somewhere in the middle, and one of the things with intuitive eating is ideally there are no food rules, which again is very scary for women to contemplate. But when you have no food rules, for example, my one food rule is that I don't eat gluten because I feel like absolute garbage when I eat it. But other than that, there's no other food that's off the table. I eat all kinds of foods. And because I know that I can eat whatever I want, I don't spend a lot of time dreaming about chocolate cake or French fries or potato chips because I know I could have those anytime I wanted. But because I've removed the restriction, my body at this point just naturally now wants foods generally that make me feel good. And for me, that's, lots of healthy fats, it's fruits and vegetables, it's whole grains. I understand it's not something that women are going to be able to do necessarily overnight, but I think so much of the fear around intuitive eating is this loss of trust in oneself. And the idea that if you move out of the restrictive pattern, you're going to end up binge eating, which binge eating is the result of restriction, right? So if you can remove the restriction, you will typically take care of the binge eating as well. They almost always go together.
It's funny. I had to share, again, part of our women's health group. I shared a typical day in my life and talked about and my food rules because this is what the conversation was about. And I said, I don't eat gluten unless I really want it.
Yeah.
Which made them all laugh. And then I said, come on, who goes to the keg and has that bread show up at the table and doesn't eat it, right?
So good.
That's not a thing in my life. That can't be. And you're right. Like when I think about that more sort of intuitive eating, I certainly do not have that bread every day. And I love that idea of women needing to, I always use the term bird's eye viewing their diet a little bit more, because I think it does release them from some of the shame that they don't need to micromanage their meals, that we all have. I always say everyone has the peanut butter sandwich in the back of their van in a hockey arena kind of day in their life, right? Mm-hmm. Where if we can release ourselves from that, it probably doesn't happen quite as often, right? Or if we can bird's eye view what our week actually looks like, if that's happening 3 nights a week, we have a problem, right? If Thursday nights is the night that nutrition is not the forefront of your health because you're doing other things or you're supporting other people in your family, fine, right? Yeah. But that looking at it from that more macro level, no pun intended. I don't mean macronutrients. I mean big picture.
Big picture, yes.
Looking at it from that big picture perspective lets you see that you're maybe only making poorer nutritional choices 4 or 5 days a month, which is fine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If it's 20 days a month that you're feeling uncomfortable about your nutrition choices, you need more infrastructure so that the food is more readily available to you, or you need better resources to make sure that you can execute on what your actual nutrition goals are.
Yeah. And I would say to that the answer to, improving your nutrition should be adding foods, not taking away. But our tendency and what we see when we look for nutrition information is that it's always focused on all the foods you should be removing. Whereas I like to teach women about nourishment, right? We need to start to look at calories, not as something that causes weight gain, but calories are a source of energy. That's what calories are at the end of the day. They are energy for your body. And so if you want to have enough energy to get through your day, if you want your brain to be sharp and you can think clearly and concentrate throughout the day, you need energy, you need fuel for that. And food is how we get that fuel. So a big part of, if you're having issues in terms of cravings or you're overeating at the end of the day, it's often the result of not eating enough earlier in the day, or that you've so restricted a certain part of your diet that you end up completely overdoing it at another point. So I really like to teach women about how we can start to actually focus on adding more, making sure that you're eating enough. I was talking about this yesterday in my group. A granola bar is not breakfast. Okay. A muffin is not breakfast. 1 piece of toast with peanut butter is not a breakfast.
An egg. That's always my favorite.
Yeah. That's
an egg. An egg?
Yeah. And who eats one egg, first of all? But you just ate 70 calories for breakfast and you wonder why you're exhausted and you can't think straight by 10 a.m. That is not a breakfast, right? So how do we teach women how to create balanced, nourishing meals that provide fuel, they provide energy, and they provide nutrition? Because again, a big part of I teach my thyroid women is that your thyroid needs specific nutrients in order to work properly. And if those are not being consumed in your diet, you're going to be at a deficit in terms of your thyroid doesn't have the building blocks it needs to do its job. So I really like to encourage bringing more foods, bringing more variety into the diet, right? Most of the women I see buy the same fruits and vegetables week in and week out, whether it's like middle of the winter in February or it's like summer in July, right? Most of us are not eating a wide variety of food. So there's so many simple and enjoyable level our nutrition that does not involve restriction and that does not involve removing all of your favorite foods, because that's just not an enjoyable way for most of us to live. And again, I think we forget that diets can be a huge source of stress on our system, right? And so if you're eating in a way that is not enjoyable, if you're eating in a way where you're not eating enough calories, the other thing that's very harmful for women's health in general, but specifically for thyroid, are very low carbohydrate diets, which are incredibly popular right now. Again, when you're eating in such a way that you're restricted, that senses or triggers a stress response. Your brain is designed to sense out threats. That's its main job. It's spending your entire day scanning for threats, which is how humans have survived so long. But we have threats all over the place in our environment. And now for women, we've also added food stress because of the way that most of us eat or don't eat enough of. And so all of that just adds up to put a huge strain on the thyroid. And it ends up, like I said earlier, it ends up actually slowing down your thyroid. So you don't get the desired impact, which is weight loss, because your whole metabolic system slows down. So it doesn't actually work in the long term.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's so important, because those diets are getting marketed for weight loss. And yet every time women go through a period of calorie restriction, their metabolic rate is coming down, right? So like the many, many years and layers of dieting that's there is having a impact on just bottom line when it comes to metabolic rate. But then specifically that the restriction, with the specific macronutrients. So I always pick on the ketogenic diet,
Yes, me too.
which is like the purpose of that is to put your body into a state of experiencing a quasi-famine state, right? And if we think just, physiologically, what would happen during a quasi-famine or during a famine is your brain does get super alert. You do feel like you have a lot of energy so that you can stay up all night and go hunt because where food is scarce. But
because your
also,
brain thinks you're starving, right?
People say, I have so much energy. I feel the best I ever have. I can do a million things in a day. I'm like, yeah. And your brain is hoping one of those things is to go find some sourdough bread. But the other thing that it does is it shifts your metabolic rate, right? So your thyroid, and I've even seen some numbers, I'm not going to quote specific studies, but where, T4 numbers are coming down by 20, 25, 30%, 6 to 8 weeks into a ketogenic diet as a compensatory mechanism. Because your body is literally like, dude, we're in a famine. Let's not burn. We can't burn fuel at 100% here. Food is scarce. We don't know when our next meal is. And that's being driven by those food choices. And the same thing will happen when women really restrict protein. And I don't think women restrict protein intentionally. I think women, I don't know what your experience is, Sarah, but my experience is women don't restrict protein intentionally. They don't understand the value of it, what it does in their body, and they don't understand where it comes from in their diet. So women will not realize that by under eating on protein or that their needs are higher than they think, right? That when I calculated out for women, 1.5, 1.7 grams per kilo of their body weight, they're like, whoa, like that's way more than they ever would have thought. And I think, well, if you eat under that and your body, like if you, even for a fraction of a second, start to metabolize your bicep to meet your own protein needs, your brain knows there's a problem, right? If for half a second we decide to eat our own muscle tissue to make up for the fact that you haven't eaten any protein today, your thyroid knows, right? And so under fueling on protein is like literally just turning down thyroid function, like in a fraction of a second. And we think about the number of women that have gravitated towards plant-based diets, but that's not their diet of culture or diet of cultural origin. And so they don't do it properly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And they literally just don't realize that they're eating like 20 or 30 grams and they need 100.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to this concept of like under eating or under nourishing. So if we use kind of like a simple number, which is, let's say you're eating about 1,500 calories a day, that means each of your meals should be about 500 calories. Most of the women that I see in my practice, their breakfast is nowhere near that. And neither is their lunch, and I'm using air quotes, of cheese and crackers and carrot sticks. That is not a full meal. And again, you're not getting the calories that you need to fuel energy. You're definitely not getting the protein you need when you're eating teeny tiny meals, right? So we need to look at proper meals that include the right amount of protein, that have a good mix of like fat, carbs, veggies, so that your body is getting everything you need. And that's really hard to do when you're eating teeny tiny meals. The other thing, which I'll throw into the mix because it's also very popular right now, is intermittent fasting. So, intermittent fasting does have some benefits for women in particular, but we've taken it like we do to the complete extreme where now we're eating in like an 8-hour window during the day. So, for example, women might be, eating from noon until 8 p.m. and the rest of the time they're fasting. Well, again, when you are not eating, your brain doesn't know that your fridge is full of food and that you're just choosing not to eat. Your brain thinks there is no food around. And so if you're not eating, there's no food around, again, that's going to have a negative impact on your thyroid. So one of the things that I encourage, if you're doing a keto diet or if you're doing intermittent fasting, you want to get some of this thyroid testing done to see if it's having a negative impact. It's not going to harm everybody. Some people do fine on these diets. A lot of women don't. And one of the easiest ways to do that, besides how you feel, is to look at your thyroid numbers. And one of the numbers that I look at, which we haven't talked about yet, is reverse T3. Reverse T3 is what I refer to as the hibernation hormone because it makes you feel like a tired bear in the winter. It makes you exhausted and sluggish. It makes you, your cognition slows down, you put on weight, you feel cold. And that is basically your body's protective mechanism when things are highly stressful. So the reverse T3 is basically like a giant brake that's going to slam on your thyroid to slow things down. And we can measure these levels. So one of the things that I look at when I'm looking at blood work is, how is your thyroid hormone being used? Is your T4 being turned into T3, which is the active one that you want? Or is it being turned into reverse T3, which is the like stress-induced hibernation hormone? If you're eating in a way that is causing stress on your body, we're going to be able to see that you're probably favoring this reverse T3 pathway as opposed to the free T3 pathway. So there are ways that we can get a sense of how diet and other types of stress are having an impact on the thyroid, because it's not always, obvious just by how people are feeling.
So what is like the woman's first step to getting like reoriented with what's going on here? Like I think you've mentioned that the lab work is super important. I think we've given women some things to think about with respect to their fueling. And I wanted to layer in one more example I will give my women is I'll say like, we will not send our kids to school without food, right?
Right.
If your kid stands in the kitchen and goes, well, I don't want to eat breakfast, what do? You make them sit at the table and eat their breakfast, right? You would never, and yet, right, I'll have seen my women patients are like, well, I don't feel like eating in the morning. And I'm like, but then you're not eating until like 2 p.m, right? And think about how much of your day and how much you are demanding of yourself with no food. We would never let our kid do that.
No, they'd be a disaster.
And they would be an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
So, there's the testing piece. I think we need to think a little bit more critically about our fueling and about our nutrition. What is sort of like the curious woman's way of starting to think about her thyroid a little differently, so that she can get started on kind of tackling this?
Mm-hmm. So there's kind of four pieces that I look at kind of as a foundation. So two of which we've talked about. One is the hydration. So we all know that we should be drinking water. That's pretty well known. What most people don't realize is that your liver and your kidneys are two of the main areas where your thyroid hormones get activated. So when we talked about T4 getting converted into T3, the active form, a lot of that happens in the liver and the kidneys. So it's really important that we're properly hydrated, that we're mindful of our caffeine and our alcohol intake within that. The second piece is the nourishment, right? So even just looking, and we talked about this last night in our group, how often are you eating? Are you eating once a day? Are you eating 12 times a day? Like, let's just start to look at how we're eating. How many times a day are you eating? How long is it taking you to eat? Are you eating like as you're rushing out the door, getting your kids to an activity, or are you eating quickly at your desk in between meetings? Again, we get so focused on what we're eating that we also have lost sight of just the proper mechanics of eating, which is eating like proper meals, sitting down, which I know is like a revolutionary idea. A lot of us are not even sitting down. And one of the things I share with my groups, which I find so interested, is that in Canada, women spend less than an hour a day to consume all of their meals, versus in France and Italy, it's more than 2 hours a day. Like we're so busy, we cannot even take time out to like eat, which is sad, but that's the state we live in. So some of those basic things. And then once we've kind of figured the mechanics of eating, we can certainly look into the what we're eating. The third piece is the rest piece. And this is where we look at stress levels and where we look at sleep. And we all are under way more stress than most of us realize and want to acknowledge. And I know you and I have talked about that before, but stress is one of the biggest stress is a stressor on your thyroid. And then the last piece is movement. So there's just getting women to move more throughout the day, to go for walks, just to be able to like move their body. These are some of the foundational pieces that we look at, because those four factors are actually going to set or create an environment in your body which allows your thyroid to start to work properly. And one of the things that I've realized after 10 years in practice is that the simple things are actually the most powerful, right? We all want the special goji juice or the celery juice or the supplement or the something magical that's going to make everything better. But when you actually have those four pieces in place, you often don't need all the fancy stuff, right? Everything just works better. So those are some of the areas that I would kind of focus on with my patients once we've determined kind of what's going on. But the first piece is just to like create a space for women to actually feel heard. And I know you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I think that's such a big part of, why my practice has been so successful, is that women actually just leave feeling heard. They know that I believe them. They know that I understand, and I'm giving them hope that there are things that they can do. And I think if we can encourage women to understand that they are in control of so many different parts of their health, that's a very empowering place to be, as opposed to the more kind of standard approach, which is someone prescribes you a medicine and you take it and that's it. Right? So it's about showing them what they're able to do to really help support their thyroid, whether or not they're on a medication.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really clear, right? And then layering on top of that the more comprehensive look from a lab work perspective, and then even taking that, like casting a slightly wider net to look at nutrition, iron you mentioned, and vitamin D
Mm-hmm.
has an impact
Yeah.
on thyroid antibodies. And just again, like if we solely focus on one number, it is such and I hate to use that term, like tip of the iceberg, but like it really is, right? There's so much more about the way that your nutrition and nutritional status and all that impacts your thyroid, that you can't just test one number, right? You can't just ask
Mm-hmm.
the same four questions. We need to, like, I always use the word curious, like get curious about what's actually happening with our patients and give them the space to be able to share their experience, but also, feel empowered by what the solution actually is, right?
Yeah. And one of the things that I like to share is that your thyroid affects everything, and your thyroid is affected by everything. Meaning, if your thyroid is off, you're going to have all kinds of symptoms from head to toe because your whole body is being impacted. And vice versa, everything that is happening in your body is being relayed back to your thyroid, and your thyroid is responding to that. So whether it's not sleeping enough, whether it's a hormonal imbalance, whether it's high stress, exposure to toxins, all of those things are going to be impacting your thyroid. So we need to take a step back, and we need to look at the big picture with thyroid and realize that there's a lot more to it than taking medication. Again, that's just like a small piece of the puzzle.
So what's your big sort of passion-driven message for women, Sarah? Because I love hearing you speak. I think you hold such great space for women talking about big issues like, body confidence and nutrition and having more functional relationship with food. I'd love to hear sort of your soapbox version of what your big purpose actually is. Mm-hmm. And then how can women get in touch with you and connect more with what you have to offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I've come to realize, recently, but my purpose and my mission is that I feel like we need more women in the world. We need more women politicians. We need more women CEOs. We need more women in every aspects of our lives. And we need women who are showing up, who feel good, who have energy, who are confident, who are not wasting precious mental energy, hyper focused on, what they're eating or how many calories they're eating, right? We need women who are healthy and robust and who feel amazing so that they can step into the biggest version of themselves. And part of what I love about the work that I do is that from a more energetic perspective, the thyroid relates to our voice and it relates to speaking our truth. And so part of what I, am working with my patients on, and part of the message I hope to share is that when you have your health and when you have your thyroid working for you, it also gives you the confidence to speak your voice and to share whatever, gifts you have with the world. So, I love the thyroid. I love looking at blood work. I love working with women, but my purpose is actually so much bigger than that I want women to have their health because we need women's voices out in our world more than ever. So getting in touch with me, the place that I'm hanging out the most lately is Instagram. So you can find me at Sarah Vadeboncoeur. And then my clinical website is docereclinic.ca. And that's where you can learn more about my practice and some of the services that I offer as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for us having this conversation. I think it's such an important one, and maybe it's just version one of probably what needs to be a many-part conversation about health and women in general. I so appreciate the work that you do, and I think that when I think about, the women that I look up to that are in medicine, it's interesting how similar all of our actual purpose is, right? That working with women one-on-one is such a intimate way of connecting with them and their health. But really it's about so that they can go out and run for prime minister, right? That's right. And when I think about what my goals for the podcast and all that is, I just want women to have the knowledge so that they can advocate for healthcare in a way that lets them show up with their fullest potential, because we need them all to feel well. We need them to feel confident so that they'll take the risks that we need them to take in order to move the mountains we need them to move. So I thank you so much for spending time with me today and for sharing your message, because I think it's such an important one.
Thank you for having me. It was great being on with you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their health care. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast, where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their health. self-care. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.